So it seems like at least once a year, this popular discussion arises over what race the ancient Egyptians were, or
A good introduction, but let's be honest, the real reason people care about the race of the ancient Egyptians is because they're trying to find any way to dismiss the black component. That's why they don't care about whether or not the civilizations in Greece or really anywhere else are mixed. And I'll give you another example where there are people who are dark skinned and they're trying to dismiss it. India, they go out of their way to sort of over amplify the European component in India's history and even the Arab component to try and diminish the dark skinned play in their own history.
perhaps more accurately, what skin color they were. Most people seem to be able to comprehend the fact that ancient Egypt, in the ancient world and in the modern world, is a land bridge between people living in the Near East and people living in Saharan Africa.
I'm tired of this land bridge argument. Now, I want you to think about what a bridge is, right? Let's picture a bridge, all of us in our head. A bridge, people go back and forth through that bridge. But in this bridge, apparently they only go one direction. There's a reason why people aren't saying, at least people who like the controversies, they're not saying Assyrians mixed with black Africans. It's not a bridge. They don't see it as a bridge. If it was, then the entire region would be thought of as a mixed population, as I do. But they don't. And of course, the populations at this time in history are moving around over and over. Even if you remove the fact that they're black, they keep moving around. But today, the DNA people claim that the same civilization has been in the same place for thousands of years.
So, over thousands of years, you have people with orange skin meeting people with darker brown skin. And
I don't know about you, but I've never met someone who naturally had orange skin. Orange skin is a pretty weird, I think it's a weird thought. The people who were Arabs or were Middle Eastern, they tend to have very light skin or very dark skin like other people in those regions. Orange, I think, is a weird introduction to sort of give a light tan. That light tan thing tends to be from the sun and not to be like a skin color. Very few people you can. The only person I know is orange is the president of the United States, but you don't get that naturally. That skin color is not natural.
And what do they produce? Well, they produce children with skin colors varying from each side of the scale. Every so often, you have distant traders from the greater Mediterranean arriving by boat and deciding to stay, making the pool of skin colors marginally paler in some areas of Egypt. Most people can comprehend this.
All people can comprehend this. They just disagree with it because, of course, sa- saying that the people who started and continued Egypt are some people who came in a boat, when those same exact people say that populations don't change that dramatically over a short period of time. Think about what you're saying. You're saying that tons of people were replacing the original inhabitants by the millions. It doesn't track. Even if there were people from the Mediterranean who came in, it would have been a very small group compared to the people who were already living there. Not according to me, according to the other people. Because of course, there's a second time when a bunch of people with quote unquote orange skin came through, and those are the Arabs, which are the people who are there today in Egypt. But those Arabs are said, well, you don't just replace a population by the millions, except that the Arabs say they replace the populations there, but they don't want to accept it. So you can't just say that.
But another popular argument is that the ancient Egyptians must have been an entirely dark-skinned civilization, which isn't even supported by the statuary work seen in the Old Kingdom where rulers have this burnt orange skin color.
Good job looking at 6 images when we have thousands of other images that clearly depict the ancient Egyptians as very dark. Not to mention that Herodotus called them black skinned. He didn't say they were dark skinned. He didn't say that some of them were black and some of them were white. And this was not just some people's interpretation. In fact, Zahi Hawass, who was in charge of ancient Egypt, says they were dark skinned, they just weren't Negro. The only person who doesn't believe that the ancient Egyptians weren't dark skinned is you and other people who want to believe that ancient Egyptians represented a diversity rather than a homogeneous skin color.
And then something really bizarre I saw last week was someone claiming that the Egyptians could have been white.
Robert Sapir was one of those people who first realized that he could make a ton of money by saying to other white people that the ancient Egyptians were white. And of course, every other civilized person today knows that there's no way in hell that they represented white people, especially the type that Robert Sapir wants, which is blonde, blue-eyed people running ancient Egypt. So I'm glad you separate yourself from that idiot. I don't like insulting people, but that guy deserves. That guy's a bona fide racist. And the way they portray the people in ancient Egypt is that there were a bunch of like Viking like people. So yeah, that group is stupid.
Anyway, I think it's time to set the record straight on who the ancient Egyptians were, where they came from, and how many times their racial composition changed during their ancient history. And at the
Okay, so this is what we've all been waiting for all these years. Someone who's going to set the record straight. Now, if he says the ancient Egyptians were first a native group, and then all of a sudden they were the Hyksos, and then these other groups that invaded that changed the demographic, I'm going to be really upset because that's not setting it straight. That's just repeating what everybody else says, including people like myself, because everybody knows that there were multiple invasions of ancient Egyptians that changed the demographic dramatically. But of course, when the people come in and they say these are the native Egyptians, they're extrapolating from the ones who are doing native cultural acts, separating them from people who would say, yeah, my parents came from the Persians, my parents came from the Hyksos, my parents came. There was a giant separation in culture, and you see it in the Greek times, where people who are Greek know they're Greek, people who are Egyptian know they're Egyptian, people who are Coptic know they're Coptic. It's not that hard. Also, if you say anything close to race didn't exist in the past, and then people didn't accept or didn't understand or didn't have racial groups when they had nothing but, we literally see the Greeks creating the names that would be used forever for racial groups, I'm also going to get upset.
end of this video, I think that you'll have a pretty good understanding of how vast, diverse, and complicated ancient Egypt's history really is.
The claim here is that a civilization that lasted for like 4,000 years is complicated, diverse, and hard to understand. I hope he understands how deep that is and that you cannot solve the racial problem, especially when you start talking about the future.
So we have evidence of people living in Egypt as far back as 1 million years ago.
As far back as human beings go, Egypt seems to be, like the rest of Africa, part of the founding of the human race. And so it's very possible that way before 1 million years ago, there were people in ancient Egypt. The oldest human skull that we found was in Libya, not very far away from Egypt. We know that the people in Libya had some kind of communication with people outside of Libya in West Africa and places like that. It's true that Egypt goes back this far, but this does not help us solve any problems because at this time everyone can accept that everybody here is pure African. We don't even know what Africans looked like back then. We have no idea.
This vast era marks what we call the Paleolithic period, spanning from around 1 million years ago to around 7,000 years ago, or 5000 BC. During this long period, sites like el Ka'ab, Nag Ahmed, Bar el Ha'ar, the Dakhla Oasis, and the Fayum were inhabited primarily by Homo erectus and early Homo sapiens, who were arriving in Egypt and attempting to adapt and overcome specific challenges of surviving in this environment. Now,
Be clear, because I think he made a little bit of a mistake there. Homo erectus was not around in 7000 BC.
this was many, many thousands of years before the pharaohs. And these Egyptians lived a vastly different life than what we imagine life in ancient Egypt to have been like.
So right now I'm confused about his timelines, because he said about 5000 BC, from a million to 5000 BC. 5000 BC, there's no Homo erectus. It's not early Homo sapiens, it's late Homo sapiens, really. And the lifestyle isn't so different than the ancient Egyptians, outside of a few inventions that would come in, for example, stone buildings and stuff like that. But really, everything else, like farming and stuff like that, had already been established by that time, at least in 5000 BC.
Did mostly live along the Nile River. These were semi-nomadic people, hunter-gatherer groups who seemed to have never settled in one spot for too long.
Actually, the ancient Egyptians were very settled, and even by 6000 BC, they had a sedentary lifestyle due to farming and not hunting. The nomadicness is probably inferred from the fact that other groups around them were nomads, like the Libyans and other people who lived in tents. It's not true that the ancient Egyptians were nomadic, at least not in the true sense of the word. They had already accepted farming. They had already lived in certain dwellings that didn't change for a long time, made out of mud brick. But I understand why he's saying this. It's like one of those things where it's like trying to distance from the civilizations that would come later.
Although multiple waves of hunter-gatherers separated by thousands of years seem to have chosen many of the same locations to settle down, at least temporarily. As far as we know, these people didn't build shelters substantially enough to survive tens or hundreds of thousands of years later. If they weren't living in huts, they may have had local caves to take refuge in. And in fact, in 1933, the Hungarian explorer Laszlo Almasi discovered a Paleolithic site in the farthest reaching western deserts of Egypt. Now, this site, known as the Cave of Swimmers, dates back about 10,000 years. And is famous for its cave art depicting figures with their legs bent and stretched out as if they were swimming.
Now this is the surprising part, because he knows about the Cave of Swimmers, and he also knows about the caves in general in Egypt. Firstly, the Cave of Swimmers are on the border of Libya and Egypt and Sudan, so they're more a trifecta of that region, of those people. So the people who were living there were probably from that type of genetic group. Secondly, the caves located close to Egypt and inside Egypt have cattle, and they date back, at least have been dated back by archaeologists, historians, and all these other people, to 10,000 BC. And they show cattle, or 10,000 years ago, and they show cattle. They're not the only places in Africa that show cattle at this date, but it proves that there were cattle in this area at this time. And so to call them nomadic, when you know that the people who are probably the most nomadic were not the people living around these caves. Also, let's just leave it there. It's very difficult to be nomadic when you live in caves.
Why is there a depiction of people swimming deep inside of a cave hidden in the middle of the Sahara Desert? And furthermore, there are also depictions of a giraffe and a hippopotamus. Well, it's actually archaeological evidence like this that indicates a much greener and more tropical Sahara must have existed sometime around 10,000 years ago.
While these images and drawings are good depictions and they could be evidence of that, a much better form of evidence is science. They know about the tilting of the sun, in which it creates these points of focus where The sun is more focused towards the Sahara at some points and less focused in other points, which creates the drying of the Sahara, and we see it going back and forth over the years. This just from space. You don't even need to search anything on Earth to find this out. But, with all the evidence combined, seeing the greening, like certain places when you dig, you realize that there's stuff that's preserved that shouldn't be there and stuff like that. If you fuse all of that together, you get the Green Sahara. And then, of course, when you see the rock paintings, it sort of puts an end to it. Now, remember, Egypt has the River Nile, so it would be possible for there to be pictures of swimmers and all of that without the area being, you know, green. Just people drawing something they saw elsewhere.
Even though the Green Sahara would have been a much more inviting environment to live in as compared to the Sahara today, the intense ultraviolet radiation from the North African sun would have caused these Saharan ancestors to evolve a much darker skin color to protect them from the sun. Although as you go further back in time, their facial features would have looked increasingly different from our own. Their skin color would have been what we call today black.
Correct. Now, here's the problem. How do we go from these natives living in a beautiful area and then all of a sudden they get kicked out by some other group? How does that happen? Or did that not happen?
This same time, though, we can't ignore the populations who are also developing in the Near East, Turkey, and Greece, all having evidence of habitation dating back at least some 200,000 years.
There most certainly were not people in Turkey 200,000 years ago, as at least not Homo sapiens, and they definitely do not represent the groups that would be later there, coming from the Out of Africa movement about 70,000 years ago. And also, those people would have also been black. They would have also represented a darker pigment coming from the people from Africa. The later lighter pigments are shown to have been an adaptation that happened way late in our history, perhaps 4, 5, 6, 7,000 years ago, or even earlier, but nowhere close to 100,000 years ago.
These people would eventually come to meet these Paleolithic Egyptians, if they hadn't already, as trade routes and the ease by which human beings had the ability to travel began to rapidly increase. Around
Prehistoric ancient Egyptians clearly had large boats as well, as depicted in the same caves. And these caves that are located more to the Middle Eastern side of Egypt show that the people must have left Africa at some point as well, possibly for that trade. We see an obsidian trade that goes back thousands of years to places like Yemen and Saudi Arabia. So to say that those people came in, first of all, how many? Did trade really bring 1 million people? Did they bring 300,000 people? How many people did they bring?
Around 10,000 years ago, something catastrophic was beginning to happen in the Sahara. All of the fertile land that the newly sedentary farmers were beginning to raise cattle on was drying up.
Okay, you gotta decide whether they're sedentary or they're nomadic, because now you're going back on what you said and you're saying they're newly nomadic, and it's actually what you're saying now is matching with what I was saying, that 10,000 BC they already had farming.
The rivers were running dry and the ground became unable to bear the limited plants that ancient farmers were learning to grow. With increasingly limited options, these ancient Saharans had only 3 choices to make. They were probably familiar with trading caravans that arrived every so often from the northern coastline.
At this point, I have no idea what he's talking about, because trading caravans would be nowhere near this time in history in terms of trade and the way they moved. And caravan, if you mean the French word meaning carts, then there is no way. So I don't know what you mean by trading caravans. They were not familiar. People from 10,000 BC were not familiar with any caravans coming from anywhere. They're probably familiar with boats. They're probably familiar with some people carrying things, but a caravan is completely out of the question. But maybe you're talking about something completely different.
line. They also must have known there were more people living farther to the south in what we would call today the Congo or the Savannah. But they may have also heard of this river valley out to the east where displaced Saharans were finding a lush, tropical, fertile strip of land that existed along a huge freshwater river, perfect for continuing the kind of life they were starting to build for themselves.
There's a lot of assumptions being made there. I'm almost certain they were not aware of the people in Congo because the Congo is not just south of that area. I mean, it's so far south that almost no North African DNA has ever been found going back that date. But if you talk about West Africa in general, sure. But if you mean that they were aware of them, I don't know either, because tribes don't tend to be aware of each other. The people living in Tanzania can be completely ignorant of people living in Kenya. People living in South Africa can be completely ignorant of other people living in South Africa. It's a big world, and when you're looking at it from a top view, it may look like everybody knows that everybody is around, but they had no idea. In fact, I'm going to take everything I said back. They had no idea who was anywhere except the tribe that they belonged to for the most part. These people weren't purposefully grouping themselves or anything like that with people further south. They had no idea that those places lived, especially during the green Sahara times when there were forbidding trees that didn't allow you to travel.
This gradual migration out of the Sahara into the Nile Valley continued until around 4000 BC, when various tribes and chiefdoms began to spring up across the Nile. These cultures produced pottery that we can see today depicting daily life, animals, and even river boats with flags and sails on them. Over the next millennium, these various chiefdoms would eventually merge into two separate regions, the Upper Kingdom in the south and the Lower Kingdom in the north. We don't know.
Or, second theory, these places were separated into many scattered tribes along the Nile, and during this period, a southern leader started gathering the people and forcing them to become one tribe, and then he conquered the tribes located in the northernly regions and used one of their leaders as a symbol for the entire northerners, and then it looked like it was order versus chaos. So one king destroyed all the other kings that were located to the north, that were scattered tribes that came together to fight as a force against an organized leader, and then that leader became the ruler of both Upper and Lower Egypt.
Know what these kingdoms were called, but we refer to this period as the Two Lands. While these were two distinct kingdoms, from the archaeological evidence we can infer they were almost entirely of the same genetic makeup, as well as following largely the same religious practices and gods. And this period ends around 3150 BC, with a king in the south known as Narmer marching his way north and smiting the ruler of the opposing kingdom, thus unifying the two lands. From here, the pharaoh would become known as the ruler of the two lands. In the image of this unification, the tying of the lotus and papyrus flower would be depicted on pharaohs' thrones for the next 3,000 years. So at the time of Egypt's unification under a single ruler, the pharaoh, Egypt is as Egyptian as it's ever going to get, at least genetically speaking. We have very little evidence to definitively determine what skin color these Egyptians had. However, judging from their origins in the Sahara, as well as limited but increasing trade connections with Mesopotamia, it's probably a safe assumption to say that Egyptians in 3000 BC had a darker skin color than they do today, although it would have certainly been lighter than their South African contemporaries.
You mean Southern African people, not South African, because South Africans are just as light as Middle Easterners, to be honest.
On account that they would have had an increasing exposure to much lighter skinned people living along the greater Mediterranean. And as we continue from the early dynastic period into the height of the Old Kingdom, migration into Egypt from the east begins to rapidly increase. And while I was walking through the Old Kingdom section of the Cairo Museum a couple of months ago, I was confronted with these shockingly vibrant and lifelike statues depicting sun-tanned men with red skin. It's clear that even this early on, Egyptians have become fully assimilated with many lighter-skinned people migrating to the Nile to take advantage of this fertile land.
The fertile land concept sort of falls short when you consider the fact that at the same time as you're talking about, people in the Middle East were moving into Europe.
Into the Old Kingdom, Egypt's economy began to collapse from a wide variety of factors, including uncontrolled immigration. And just to read you, here's an excerpt from Toby Wilkinson's book, The Rise and Fall of Ancient Egypt. The weakness of a hereditary monarchy, the threat posed by climate change, the dangers of uncontrolled immigration, and the unforeseen consequences of closer foreign ties all were brought home to the Egyptians in harsh lessons that would test their civilization to the breaking point. Now, this would begin a trend in Egypt's history, where these massive influxes or invasions of foreigners would, in some cases, dramatically change the makeup of Egyptian society. Notably beginning with the Hyksos invading around 1650 BC, bringing mass amounts of new settlers onto Egypt's banks, as well as new technologies from the Levant, including the horse-drawn chariot, which was an iconic mark of the Bronze Age. Then around 750 BC, the Nubians, who had been living under the boot of Egypt for nearly 2,000 years.
Living under the boot of the ancient Egyptians is a pretty harsh way to put it, especially when most of the Nubians considered themselves ancient Egyptians.
Rose up, invaded, and conquered Egypt. Ruling for a century, the Nubian pharaohs must have dramatically increased the population of dark-skinned Nubian people living within Egypt.
A century is not that long of a time to change the demographics of the people, but the thousands and thousands of years of bordering Egypt and Egypt being interested in Nubia is probably a better place to pluck the DNA from the Nubian, Sudanese, Meroitic regions.
And shortly after this period, Egypt experienced a succession of invasions, including the Assyrians between 675 and 600 BC, the Persians between 525 and 332 BC, and the Greeks from 332 until the death of Cleopatra in 30 BC. These are centuries upon centuries of people from the greater Mediterranean world, as well as east of Egypt, moving into Egypt and dramatically diversifying its genetic makeup.
Don't say that too loud, because Zahi Hawass has got something else for you about how none of these populations affected the genetic makeup of Egypt at all.
And furthermore, many of the sites that you may visit today if you go to Egypt were in fact erected during these later periods of foreigners ruling over Egypt, such as the Temple of Dendera, Philae, and Edfu. All of these were created under the Greek dynasty known as the Ptolemies.
My previous video was about Philae and how the Nubians were very welcomed in that area, and in fact many other Greeks wrote about how this island was populated half by Egyptians and half by Nubians.
So now that you understand where the ancient Egyptians come from, who they are, who they chose to or were forced to intermingle with, you can hopefully get a sense that ancient history is far from simple. And for anyone to make a blanket statement about an ancient civilization saying, oh, they were black or oh, they were white, it's just a gross oversimplification.
Not only is it a gross oversimplification, it's a straw man, because almost no group says that. Every group accepts that there were other people, including Nubians and all kinds of people around the area. So that's just like attacking a heading or a title. In real life, the reason why it matters is because they're talking about the foundational Egyptians. Does the culture stem from Middle Easterners, or does it stem from Africa in general, and then it branches out and becomes more diverse because of the Middle East? Everybody accepts that the Middle East was somewhat special compared to other places except Egypt, and it added those special things into Egypt, like the chariot. So Nobody's denying that.
And is honestly just an ignorant thing to say, which I really think is the root of this problem. In the modern Western world, people tend to place way too much importance on the color of someone's skin than they should, and they certainly place more importance on it in the modern world than people of the ancient world did. In the past, it was more about culturalism. If you didn't subscribe to the predominant culture, religion, and language, you were seen as an other or an outsider. So to answer the ever-looming question, the Egyptians were not black, they were not white, they were Egyptians.
So many things said wrong there. One, race did matter in the past. Two, they were black, and that was referenced by so many ancient scholars, the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians. So many people said this. The Muslims, everybody said that they were black, and that's just obvious. Now, you can debate whether that means they were Negroes or not, but you can't debate that they said they were darker skinned than almost any other group in the region except the Nubians. Also, that is not an answer, that's a cop out. That's like me saying, are the ancient Greeks black or white? Well, they're neither black nor white. They're Greek. We know that the ancient Greeks were white. Everybody knows that. With obviously some people being black.
Which is an amalgamation of people living within and around the Nile. This would have encompassed people that we may call today black or white, as well as everything in between. Now, getting more pedantic, people may say, well, sure, later on, Egypt could have been occupied or populated by the Hyksos or the Persians or the Greeks, but I'm talking about the Egyptians that built the pyramids and built the Sphinx. Well, sure, if you want to look at the Old Kingdom of Egypt exclusively, sure, Egypt would not have been as heavily populated by foreigners during this time. But
Of course. And of course, you're going to mention that the modern Egyptians are nothing like the ones that were there in ancient times, because if we do your calculation, then almost all the ancient Egyptians would have been replaced by now.
still depict themselves in color, and we can see from hundreds of examples of wall reliefs and statues, they have a lighter reddish-brown complexion. They would not have met the modern standard of what we would consider black or white. They were just Egyptians, and they had an ancient Egyptian skin color. And anyone who says otherwise is either intentionally lying or they're just ignorant of everything that makes up ancient Egypt, the Egyptian people, and their history. So
This is South African rock art, and there is no mixture of genetics with Middle Eastern people, but yet the people depict themselves with the same colors that you would see in ancient Egypt. In fact, ochre tended to be the choice that most Africans used, so they looked red.